Here's Frank Turek to misunderstand atheism and how morality works.
So I'm curious to know what definition of atheist you're using. As you know, there's probably like different definitions that people use when they use the atheist label. When you say that you don't have enough faith to be an atheist, which definition are you using?
Well, the title is playing off the traditional sort of definition that people think faith means. Faith, they think, means when you don't have any evidence, you just believe it blindly.
That's the definition that the Old Testament uses, by the way. Faith is defined in Hebrews 11:1, which says that faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. I really don't understand what the difference is between believing something blindly and having a conviction of things not seen. They sound an awful lot like they're the same thing.
That's what the title is using, but that's not the definition of faith. The real definition of faith is trusting in what you have good evidence to believe.
First of all, any definition that is widely used is a real definition. But even if we grant that the definition Frank cites is the only real definition, how do you square this supposedly real definition of faith with the definition given in Hebrews? Why would the Bible give us a definition of faith that's not the real one? And if faith is trusting in what you have good evidence to believe, then one could use the term faith to refer even to belief in robustly empirically demonstrated ideas. That seems idiosyncratic to me. People don't typically say they have faith in things that have been empirically demonstrated to them. If someone tells you it's raining and you look outside and see water falling from the sky, you then have a good reason to trust that it is, in fact, raining. But would you say that you then had faith that it's raining? I don't think most people would. I've seen a few apologists try to create a definition of faith that simply means inductive inference. This seems like a new definition to me that is not only inconsistent with the definition given in Hebrews 11:1, but also one which is cynically contrived to make the concept of faith seem more reasonable.
So we're just playing off a title. So traditionally, atheists have said, I believe there is no God. There are some atheists now saying, I just lack a belief in God.
Yeah.
And I just think that's a cop-out, and it doesn't say anything about the real world. It says something about the atheist psychological state, but it's not saying anything about whether or not God exists. So I don't think that's a good definition of atheism.
Yeah.
Why not? If we're playing fast and loose with definitions, why can't atheism be a doxastic state instead of a concrete position on something? What's the problem with that? Is there a problem with giving names to doxastic states?
So I am one of those atheists that would say I lack belief. I'm not willing to say I know there's no God. Am I exercising faith? Would you say?
Well, let me ask the question this way then. Here's the proposition. God exists. Do you agree with that proposition? Do you disagree with that proposition? Or do you not know?
I would say that I don't understand what that means.
I don't know.
Okay, so you're an agnostic then.
If you have a problem with atheism being defined in such a way that it only describes a person's mental state rather than reality, then why do you seemingly have no problem with agnosticism, which you seem to agree is merely a name for a person's mental state?
I'm an agnostic atheist.
Yeah, agnostic. You don't know.
Yeah.
An atheist would be someone who says, I'm pretty sure there's no God.
Often that's the case, but it's increasingly common for people to use a definition of atheism that is broad enough to include agnosticism.
An agnostic says, I don't know, could be, maybe not.
I don't know if follow-ups are allowed, but in the book, you acknowledge that there's not perfect evidence, like there's not enough evidence to be perfectly sure there's a God. But you're still justified in being theist because there's enough evidence. Yeah. So that would be an agnostic theist, right? Somebody who doesn't know but believes. Would you allow the same for an atheist to say, I'm not convinced that a God exists, but I'm not saying that I know there's not?
Well, I think the preponderance of the evidence beyond, for me, a reasonable doubt is that God exists.
That doesn't answer the question.
Could I be wrong? Of course I could be wrong. We could be in the matrix, right? There's no way of knowing we're not in the matrix. You got to get outside the matrix to know that. Now, I just think that's silly.
Then would you agree that it would be appropriate to call your view agnostic theism or not?
But it's possible. Yeah. Okay. So let me ask you then, if historic Orthodox Christianity were true, would you become a Christian?
Define Christian.
If you define Christian as merely believing that Jesus is God incarnate, then by definition, believing that doctrine of Christianity is true makes you a Christian.
Like following Jesus' commands and trusting in him for your salvation.
I suppose that would depend on what Jesus commanded me to do. If he commanded me to do something intolerable to my conscience, then not only would I not do such a thing, I would simply be psychologically incapable of doing it.
Jesus said, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments.
Yeah.
Well, believing that he is God incarnate and loving him are two different things now, aren't they? One does not necessarily entail the other.
I would say it would. I would need more information. I would be.
No, if it were true.
Yeah. I'm saying then it would depend on what his commands are, whether I agreed with them. So I don't think it's.
Wait. Sorry. So you're saying if God existed and you disagreed with his commands, you wouldn't.
Yeah, of course.
You would go your own way.
Again, if his commands are intolerable to my conscience, then I would be unable to do anything other than go my own way. If that means that I am condemned to hell, then I am inescapably hellbound. There's nothing I can do about that.
Of course.
Okay. God gives you the free will to do that. But is that a rational position?
It's neither rational nor is it irrational. As David Hume pointed out, it is not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the whole world to the scratching of my finger. Hume didn't mean that there's no difference between the two, or that it doesn't matter which you prefer. He meant that it is ultimately a matter of what your conscience can tolerate and not a matter of reason or logic. Being rational can help you find the most effective way to achieve your goals, but it can't tell you what your goals ought to ultimately be. There is no way to reason one's way to obeying Jesus, even if he is who he said he is, because there is no objective, non-circular reason why anyone ought to do what God tells us to do. Why ought we obey God's commands? Because he says we should? You see how that's circular, right?
I think so.
Why? How?
As a hypothetical, if he asked me to murder my son, I wouldn't do it.
Okay. And?
So I think that's rational to disobey if he asked me to do something.
But if you knew it was God?
Yeah, even if I knew it was God.
And you knew that God could resurrect your son?
Yep.
Well, unless I got a guarantee from God that he would be resurrected, I don't see how I could be psychologically capable of doing such a thing.
See, the whole Abraham thing is a foreshadowing of Jesus on the same mountain, Mount Moriah.
Mm.
Well, what happened with Abraham doesn't really fit the scenario that Frank is depicting. Abraham wasn't told to kill his son with a guarantee or even a suggestion that his son would be resurrected. And in fact, Isaac wasn't resurrected. An angel stepped in and stopped the killing from happening in the first place.
And God stops Abraham, but he doesn't stop Jesus from being killed because Jesus is the sacrifice. He's the lamb.
Yeah, but God, we are told, was Jesus. That's also not analogous to the scenario in question. If I believed that my son was God incarnate, then I wouldn't look at killing him as being at all the same thing as killing a mortal.
Mm-hmm. But is God going to ask you to kill your son?
How could he possibly know? Maybe he would, maybe he wouldn't, but he would likely ask me to discriminate against LGBT folks, and that I simply cannot do.
No, it's just a hypothetical.
Yeah,
I'm just using it as
but given where we are now, we're past all the revelation in that regard.
Yeah.
If it were really true that Jesus is the Savior and loves you and wants to have a love relationship with you, would you enter that love relationship and accept what he's done?
What would that entail exactly? If it would entail obeying commands that are intolerable to my conscience, then not only is it the case that I would not, it is also the case that I simply could not. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.